This is another one of those forgotten Black history stories. It's a story of nothing but injustice, and it's one of those stories where you have to redefine what winning means. A lot of what I'm going to talk about might be tough to hear because this happened to real Black people. This is going to be another long story, but if you like learning about Black history, then you'll have no problem sticking with me to the end of this video. Because what you're going to learn in this video, I guarantee you will never forget it. This is the story of James and Ada Sanders, a Black couple who was prosecuted in 1915 for a crime the white men had routinely gotten away with. Before I get into what happened with James and Ada, I have to give you some history first. This history will be important to understand what happened to them and why their case is so important. So give me a few moments while I break this down for you. Racism has long been a part of the American legal system, and in no area has it been more apparent than in juries. The trial by jury system is a central feature of American law. It was brought to America from England and was a part of the colonies during Revolutionary times. In fact, one of the injuries that was cited in the Declaration of Independence was that King George had deprived the colonies of the benefit of a trial by jury. The right to trial by jury was placed in the Constitution for our new nation. That's how important it is to our society. From independence through Civil War, serving on a jury was something that only white men were allowed to do. After the Civil War, the country entered what was called the Reconstruction period. Laws were passed to help Black people move out of chattel slavery and into freedom as new citizens. The 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments were all passed abolishing slavery, guaranteeing basic civil rights, and equal protection of the law for Black people. Black people began to vote all across the South. Black people were even elected to state and federal office. Hiram Revels, he was elected to the U.S. Senate to represent Mississippi and became the first Black person to do so. Blanche Bruce was elected right along with him to serve in the Senate. There are dozens more like Oscar Dunn, who served as governor of Louisiana during Reconstruction. And because jurors are pulled from voting rolls, that meant that in some parts of the South, Black people were actually beginning to serve on juries during this period. In New Orleans in the 1870s, Black people served on federal grand juries. And in Washington County, Texas, Black people made up over 30% of all jurors until the late 1870s. Reconstruction came to an end in March of 1877 with a compromise of 1877. The federal government withdrew troops and ended Reconstruction in exchange for Southern Democrats' support to elect Republican Rutherford Hayes to the office of president. This essentially ended any protection that Black people had from former Confederate soldiers and slave owners who wanted to put Black people back into chains, which is what the South had wanted to do all along. Southern states were angry about losing the Civil War and about how Black people were enfranchised during Reconstruction. After Reconstruction ended, South Carolina, like many Southern states, went to work on making sure that Black people were disenfranchised. The first Jim Crow laws were enacted in 1877 to limit Black people's freedoms. These laws dictated all aspects of formerly enslaved Black people's lives, from work hours and duties to behaviors. These laws prohibited Black people from entering certain towns and cities and criminalized every aspect of Black life. Laws were also passed to stop Black people from voting and also serving on juries. To ensure that Black people could not vote and thereby serve on a jury, South Carolina and other southern states came up with tools like literacy tests and poll taxes and disqualification based on criminal records to prevent Black people from voting and serving on juries. These laws were designed to capture as many Black people and as few whites as possible. Led by its future governor and U.S. Senator Pitchfork Bill Tillman, South Carolina passed a new state constitution in 1895 that was specifically designed to prevent Black people from voting and serving on juries. He said that the Reconstruction-era Constitution had established a rule of Black people over whites and that this had to stop. And this brings us to the story of Ada and James Sanders. Ada and James Sanders were married and lived in Columbia, South Carolina. Everyone called James by his nickname, Bogus. On Tuesday, May 25, 1915, three white men, Charles Ellers, his brother-in-law George Roof, and a friend named John Crouch, had gone out to drink after work. After a night of drinking, they headed back to Olympia Village, where Ellers and Crouch lived and worked. At the time, Columbia was a booming textile mill town. It was a city that provided a good way of life for white textile workers. But the mills were mostly closed to Black people, and because of this, white mill workers often displayed an even greater sense of racial privilege. Actually, in 1915, South Carolina adopted a law that prohibited textile firms from mixing Black and white workers in the same room. This ensured that the textile factories remained all white. It was this sense of racial privilege that the three white men carried with them as they made their way to the predominantly Black section of Columbia on the evening of May 25, 1915. As the white men walked down the street, they passed a Black woman named Ada Sanders. Ada was carrying a basket and walking to her home that she shared with her husband, Bogus Sanders. The three white men began to touch and harass Ada. This was a common thing in the South during those times. White men routinely took advantage of Black women. The Civil War had ended chattel slavery, but not the mistreatment and violation of Black women by white men. It was this history that Ada Sanders encountered when she was attacked by Ellers, Ruff, and Crouch that night. Ada actually went out of her way to keep from passing these three white men when she initially saw them, but they followed her, and when they caught up with her, they asked her if she was a prostitute. Charles Ellis actually asked Ada if she wanted to go and grind on the bed with him. When she said no, that's when things escalated and they grabbed her. She ran home crying and disheveled. When she arrived home, she told Bogus what happened. He was upset with the attack on his wife, so he grabbed his weapon and he and Ada went out to find these three white men. They found them and Bogus confronted them. Charles Ellis said that he did not insult Ada. Things calmed down and Bogus thought it was over and began to walk away. That's when the three white men began throwing bricks at him and pulled out their knives. Bogus fired in self-defense. He fired 5 times, striking Charles Ellis. A police officer heard the firing and came to the location and immediately arrested Bogus and Ada. Charles Ellis died 2 days later from his injuries. The prosecution of Bogus and Ada happened very quickly. The incident occurred on May 25th. Charles Ellis died 2 days later on May 27th, and on May 28th, a coroner's jury investigated the incident. The very next day, on May 29th, a Saturday, a grand jury indicted Ada and Bogus. Ada and Bogus both pleaded not guilty, and 2 weeks later on June 10th, they were tried. At their trial, the entire event was racialized. Bogus was constantly referred to as the darky. The press sensationalized the event, and prosecutors and white observers could not understand the black man standing up for his wife and defending her honor. This is surprising given that there are countless black boys and black men who were lynched because of false allegations of white women being offended by something they said or did. Emmett Till lost his life after he allegedly whistled at a white woman. Willie James Howard was thrown into the river after he gave a white girl a Christmas card. And there are so many more that I didn't mention who have died in similar tragic ways. But the white population found what Bogus did unthinkable. The Sanders were represented by 2 black attorneys, Nathaniel J. Frederick and Jacob A. Moorer. But they were not just 2 ordinary black lawyers. They were giants in their own right. Moorer and Frederick were just 2 of the 29 black lawyers in South Carolina that practiced alongside 818 white lawyers. This was despite the fact that in South Carolina, black people made up the majority of the population. These 2 black men were outspoken civil rights crusaders. Frederick argued over 30 cases in front of the South Carolina Supreme Court on behalf of his black clients. Frederick was also the head of the Howard School, South Carolina's only public high school for black children at that time. He was also the owner and the editor of the Palmetto Leader, a black newspaper that spoke out against racial violence against black people. Jacob Moorer was equally as accomplished. He was admitted to practice law in 1896, the year South Carolina's disenfranchising constitution went into effect. He was the chair of the local Republican Party and ran for the state legislature. He was also a fearsome champion of civil rights. He fought for voting rights and had a long record of fighting to make juries more fair. Moorer and Frederick were hated for their activism because they used the legal system to challenge the unjust system itself. It was because of this dedication and fighting injustice that Bogus and Ada actually hired them. The Sanders attorneys had no time to prepare. They asked the judge for a continuance, but that request was denied. And because the trial happened so quickly, the anger of the white community was still raging when the trial started. Their attorneys filed motions with the judge requesting that the entire process be restarted with new grand jurors, because black people had been excluded from the grand jury and the coroner's jury. All of the investigating jurors were white men. Judge Hayne P. Price refused that request. At trial, the prosecution put on a case full of lies. One of the white men that harassed Ada, E.J. Crouch, he claimed that Charles Ellis was not talking to Ada at all. He said as they were walking, Ellis was recounting a story where he asked a woman years before if she wanted to grind on the bed with him. And by chance, Ada Sanders happened to be walking by at the exact moment, and she wrongly assumed that he was talking to her. The prosecution also presented testimony from witnesses that said that the white men were never violent, and that it was Ada that told Bogus to fire the weapon, and that Ada had asked a neighbor to lie in court on her behalf. Ada and Bogus denied all of this. Ada and Bogus testified in their own defense. We don't know much about what Ada testified to because the media failed to mention her testimony and only focused on her husband's, but Bogus said that he went back and told the white man that they needed to be more careful when talking to women. Bogus testified that he fired to keep them from hurting him. He wasn't trying to hit anyone. The jury took no time to deliberate. They got the case at 1 p.m., and before the clock struck 2, the jury had returned its verdict finding Ada not guilty and Bogus guilty with no recommendation of mercy. Judge Rice told Bogus that he'd been given a fair trial as if he had been the most prominent white man in the state. He then sentenced Bogus to death by electrocution, with the electrocution to take place within the next 30 days. After Bogus' conviction, his attorneys vowed to appeal his case to save his life, and also to make the law fairer for all black people. They wanted to make juries more representative of the population and less racist. When Judge Rice refused to grant their request for a new trial and said that Bogus' case had been perfectly fair, attorneys Frederick and Moorer said that they'd be willing to appeal his case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court if that's what it took to free Bogus. Attorneys Frederick and Moorer had an uphill battle before them. On paper, South Carolina had elaborate laws and procedures that were seen to protect black people from disenfranchisement and make it nearly impossible to exclude black jurors on the basis of race. But in reality, that was not the case. That's because the law was left in the hands of white jury commissioners who used their power to filter out black people out of any jury pools. The 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution bars states from disenfranchising black voters, and the Civil Rights Act of 1875 extended similar protections to jury selection process. And the U.S. Supreme Court had barred states from excluding black people from juries on account of race in the 1879 case called Strata versus West Virginia, after West Virginia passed an outright ban on black jurors. But that was what the law said on paper. Attorneys Frederick and Moore knew that the law had to be carried out in action and not in the law books. And that is what they sought to challenge with the Sanders case. They argued that black people were unfairly excluded from their jury. Black residents constituted the majority of the county where the Sanders trial took place, and the juries in their case were all white. In their appeal to the South Carolina Supreme Court, one of the arguments that attorneys Frederick and Moore made was that the jury selection process conducted at the trial was done in a discriminatory manner. At the Sanders trial, attorneys Frederick and Moore sought to remove any jurors with racial bias from the jury, and the judge flat out refused. A white man named R.L. Bailey was asked if anything would prevent him from ruling fairly in the case, and he said that his natural resentment towards black people might prevent him from rendering a fair verdict. Despite this admission of clear bias, the judge found him fit for jury service. In 1916, the South Carolina Supreme Court unanimously ruled in favor of Bogus Sanders. Attorneys Frederick and Moore did not win all of their arguments, but the court could not ignore the statement of the juror R.L. Bailey, who said that he did not like black people, and the trial judge finding him fit for jury service. The court reversed Bogus's conviction on that and ordered a new trial to be had. Bogus Sanders was retried on May 24, 1916. A new judge took over the case, Judge M.L. Smith. This time, the prosecution and the judge were much more cautious in their actions. Bogus's attorneys were given the time they requested to defend him. They were allowed to put on more witnesses and more evidence, and to present Bogus's testimony in a way that was favorable towards him. The jury deliberated for 20 hours, unlike the 2 hours they did at his first trial. They still found Bogus guilty, but this time they recommended mercy instead of the death penalty. The fight to free Bogus did not end. In 1920, a white law firm filed a clemency petition on behalf of Bogus, who by this time had spent 5 years in prison. They told South Carolina Governor Robert Cooper that Bogus had been a model citizen prior to this incident. The judge in the retrial, Judge M.L. Smith, he submitted a letter recommending that Bogus be paroled. The leader of the chain gang that Bogus worked on also supported his release. And most shocking of all, 9 of the 12 white jurors that voted to convict Bogus at his retrial signed the pardon petition. The jurors said that Bogus was justified in his actions in defense of his wife. Bogus was granted a pardon by the governor on June 1, 1921. The last record of Bogus and Ada was in 1940, with them living in Columbia and him working as a dishwasher at a cafeteria. We don't know what happened to them or when they died, but we do know that they were able to move on from this nightmare that all started because one black man decided to defend the honor of his wife and paid dearly for it. I wish I could tell you that there's fairness in the jury selection process today, but that's just not the case. In trials I've had, I've seen black people struck off the jury solely because they were black. What happened to Ada and Bogus Sanders is still happening to black people today. I want to know your thoughts on this story. What did you think about what happened to Ada and Bogus Sanders? How did it make you feel knowing all that they went through and the fact that black people were not allowed to serve on juries back then? Drop me a comment down below and let me know what you think.